The following program is a presentation of Winchester Academy.
All right, is that working okay for everyone? All right, thank you all for your time today. I'm really excited to be here and talk about games. To get us started, who plays video games? Hey. Who plays Words with Friends? Or Wordle? Oh, so you do play video games. You lied to me. Okay, so when we think about games, there's actually a whole bunch of different things that fall in this space of playing games, playing video games. And today I'd like to think about, can we save the world with games? Now, to know a little bit more about me, I consider myself an intermittent gamer. I teach a psychology of video games class, primarily to game design students at UW-Stout. I don't play a ton of games myself. I have an 8-year-old. There's not a lot of time. But I play when I have a chance. And that's important for you to know, because I'm going to say games are awesome, games are important. But when you hear someone say that and they're playing it all the time, we're like, what do you know? And so I want you to think about the space where I play when I have time, when it interests me, but it's not something that I do all the time. Other important thing you need to know about me, I'm a social psychologist. Most of the time when someone hears a psychologist, they're afraid your mom's going to come up, couches are going to come up. That's not me. I'm a social psychologist, which means I study individual people in group settings. So you here right now is far more interesting than your mom, your dad, your couch. That's not what I like to study. Instead, I like to think about how is a situation when there's a bunch of people going to influence your mood, your next actions, and so we can think about when there's traffic and road construction. There's always road construction. How are you going to anticipate? How are you going to work around that? How can we make that less frustrating for other people? Now, that's not my particular area. I actually really am interested in academic motivation. So when we've got students in the classroom, what can we do to get them excited, keep them passionate, keep them motivated to do those things that are exciting for them? So that's really where I like to live in terms of research that I do. But we're here for video games today. So I'd like us to play a game together to begin with. We're going to play a simple game, though. Video games for all of us in this space is just not going to work out. So I need you to turn to your neighbors, and I know some of you have warm beverages, so do be very careful if you get competitive about this. But find a neighbor. We're going to play rock, paper, scissors. Now, this gets intense at times. We all have different rules for this. So we're going to play by my rules for today. You're going to do rock, paper, scissors, and then on that fourth move, that's when you're going to do your action. If you need to throw a shoot in there too, go right ahead. All right, so find your neighbor, 3 rounds. We need a competitive element here. So you can do rock, paper, or scissors. Ooh, let's do a double check here. So to know if you won, paper covers rock, rocks break scissors, but scissors cut the paper. Thank you, there we go. All right. Then cat's eye, do it one more time. Thank you, Ian. All right, so 3 rounds, go ahead. And you're going to have to turn back. All right, let's bring that back together. Let's see, how do we keep this? All right, who won? Figure out. Raise your hand if you won. Excellent. Who's competitive? All right, you know who you are. We may not admit it in all the spaces. All right, so that's our first game. Game number 2, we don't have quite enough room. What I'd like you to think about in this room, and this room's extra challenging, if we were about to play hide and seek, where would you hide? Or where could you hide? Go ahead, look around, find those spots. If you need some inspiration, All right, sounds like we've got our spots. Last challenge. If you were an 8-year-old, where would you hide in this room? Ooh, now, Ian's already been identified. I was going to have you look for him, but he's already been called out. Do you want to wave again, Ian? So Ian has selected the spot in this room where he would actually hide. So where do you think Ian would hide? Ooh, under the chairs?
Cabinet.
Under the purple tarp, in the cabinet? Oh, in the garbage can. He's pretty flexible. He might fit. So he selected this podium, which even fancier has a drawer over here, so you wouldn't even see him. But as a social psychologist, that's the type of thing I'm trying to think about. What would somebody do? How are we anticipating others' dynamics? So that's the space, when I think about research, that's where I'm coming from. And when we think about games, it turns out that's what you're doing too. So the activities we just did, we just played rock, paper, scissors. We thought about hide and seek. And we're moving into the space of we're having fun. It looked like a lot of you had big smiles on your faces. That competitiveness really came out for a few of you. We started thinking creatively about where we would hide, where we'd anticipate other people hiding. And we're really thinking about other human beings, which are all really important things. And it turns out games do these really, really well. Now, when we think about these things, one of the important concepts that we can think about with fun is this idea of flow. And the concept of flow is that you get so absorbed in activity, you lose track of time. So we actually, it looks like, could have stayed playing rock, paper, scissors for a good amount of time. And you wouldn't even notice, like, oh, great presentation, good job. My job was very easy at that situation. But that's that flow state. Now, when we think about flow, we're thinking about this element of what's your ability level, which is going to be different for us when we think about hide and seek, how flexible you are, how small you are to begin with to hide in certain spots, versus the level of challenge. And so when we're thinking about flow, we want to have some amount of ability, something that you're not good at all, not fun. That's stressful, that's hard, we're resistant to that. But if we can balance some skill and feeling a little bit of challenge going on, then we get this flow state. And then we're excited to do more and keep trying. And that's something that video games do really well, which we'll talk about more later. We're also activating our brain, getting more engaged, staying focused. As we get locked into routines in our lives, we don't have to stay quite as engaged. Some of you have probably driven your car before and then been surprised when you got to your location. You were engaged. You got there safely. The cops didn't pull you over. So you knew what you were doing, but you weren't really stimulated the whole time. And games is a space where we can get that extra stimulation when other things might not be as active. Now, the other cool part here is this thinking about other people's actions. And if you've played board games, chess, checkers, things like that, we're moving into a space where we're thinking about strategizing. I need to anticipate the other player's moves so I can win, for that competitive side, which is interesting and important. But it turns out, as we start thinking about other people and anticipating what they're going to do, that also opens a window to think about connecting with them and empathizing with them and understanding somebody who might be a little bit different from you and how those experiences might differ. And with these three ideas together, I'd like to argue that we can use video games as a tool to make these things happen. So for the rest of the presentation today, I'd like you to think about video games as a tool. Yes, they're games. Some of you may have favorable or less favorable opinions about them. But we're going to think about, is it a tool, or how can it be a tool to get these things accomplished? Now, there are some myths out there about video games being good, bad, or otherwise. And so for today, I'd like to think a little bit about what are some of those myths, what seems to be true based on the research that we've seen on them, and what might be a little bit different. But one of the important things is oftentimes when people say video games are good or video games are bad, we just lumped all the video games together. Whether they are shooting-based video games with a lot of violence, whether they are casual games like Candy Crush and Words with Friends and Wordle. And that's just not really realistic when we think about doing research. Each has their own space, each has their own implications. how long you spend playing them, who you're playing with, how you're choosing to play, all makes a big difference. So this is actually a far more complicated question. So we're going to think about a couple of myths. There are actually quite a few out there, so I've selected 3 for us to focus on today. The big elephant always in the room is this idea, do video games lead to violence and desensitization? So we're going to look at that. We're going to think about, are video games hurting your eyes? How many of you have told somebody or heard someone say playing video games is going to make your eyes go bad? Okay? And then this concern about social isolation. And then I'd like to end today thinking about, once we learn about these, is there a space for games to help us save the world? Now, this first myth is this idea of video games are going to lead to people being more violent in their day-to-day lives. Old school psychology research that really started this idea comes from Bandura's Bobo doll study in 1961. In this classic psychology study, we have small children. They have a Bobo doll. I'm going to jump ahead for just a moment. Many of us played with these. And what happened in this room is the children had a bunch of toys they could play with, and then they observed. Did the children beat up the Bobo doll? Did they say mean things to it? Did they hit it with other toys? But first, half of the children got to watch an adult first choose to beat up the Bobo doll. And so the idea is, if it's demonstrated to you, it turns out those kids were far more likely to want to hit the Bobo doll as opposed to playing with any of the other toys in the room. Whereas those who didn't observe that first didn't really choose to hit the Bobo doll. And so here we have this learned behavior. I've seen it, now I do it, which does lead to some concern. If I see it in a game, then I'm going to do that too. But it turns out there's one detail in this study that oftentimes doesn't get talked about. For those children in the room, one of the things that happened was they got to play in the room first, and the researchers figured out what was the coolest toy in the space. What did that individual child like the best? And then they took it out. So the kids were already in an agitated state, intentionally. So if you're in an agitated state, and then we now have a toy that we've been basically told this is okay to hit, yep, that's what we're going to do. And so that research is important, but it's also a little bit more limited in the scope. This doesn't mean, well, I've seen it, and so now I'm going to choose to hit everybody whenever I feel like it, which is a very different conversation. So we need to think about this space of, are we feeling triggered and feeling more aggressive already in the situation? This distinction between what we're allowed to hit and has been socially accepted, like the Bobo doll, versus other things. And the age appropriateness of the content. Again, lots of different types of video games. Not all ages should play all the video games at various points. And a big part of this comes down to, what are those conversations for what is acceptable? Some violence in the game, but we would never do that to another real person. And so making those distinctions are important. And it turns out most people who play video games easily make that distinction. This is an action here in this accepted space, not something we do in other spaces. And so this argument doesn't hold up quite as well as some initially thought. Other research specifically looking at video games with this then looked at, well, is there something else going on? We have images that may be more violent in some video games, and is that spurring people to be more aggressive outside of the game? And it turns out the violent content isn't. It's actually part of what's driving the narrative of the story. So in this story, there is a violent theme, but that doesn't translate to outside of that story. And so most people don't actually process the violent imagery and the violent themes with actions they would take outside of the game. What does sometimes lead to more aggressive actions outside of games is the competitive space. Some of you got competitive with rock, paper, scissors. And so then we need to think about, if we shouldn't play video games because they make us more aggressive, should we not play rock, paper, scissors? Should we take out more of our sports? And that's a whole other new messy territory. And so when we think about this, we want to think about some of those comparison points. And what we see is video games really aren't doing anything differently than any other competitive environment. Now, the other factor that tends to lead to aggressive actions after a game is frustration. Now, if the game level is challenging and hard, That's one type of frustration. But if somebody cheated in the game, that's actually the more concerning one. Or if your controllers are glitching out, things like that. We all understand this very well. If you have a problem at work, we're frustrated. We feel like throwing something, hitting something. Turns out, like this past week when it gets really hot out, people also tend to get more aggressive. So we've been there. Lots of things cause this, but it's far more that than the violent content itself. And we know this by, actually, I should say one more thing. For those of you who do play games, particularly games with controllers, one researcher wanted to really make their participants frustrated. They took people who already knew how to play video games, and they asked them to play Tetris. Now, for their controller, you think Tetris has these little pieces that you move around, and you try to fit them to interlock, and they drop down. Our controllers, if you click on the leftmost button, it'll rotate your object, or move your object to the left, to the right, goes to the right. We can drop it down with our lower buttons. The system makes sense in your brain. It takes a little bit of practice, but left is left, right is right, all makes sense. For those of you who've had to back up a trailer before, you know you have to go the opposite direction, that's where they wanted to take this controller. So this was the normal, easy one. For the frustrating controller condition, they messed with all the buttons, very similar to backing up that trailer. So now the drop button's on the side, the move left is up at the top and on the right, the move right is on the left and in the front. There's sneaky buttons in the front, not even where your thumbs are. For those who play games regularly, it makes them mad just looking at this image. So then to have to play a game that should be easy and you know well, this gets infuriating. And people get rather aggressive. No violent content required. Just Tetris, just moving blocks. But man, we're mad right now. So in this research, what they do is they've looked at, let's add some violent content in games, not in Tetris, but in other types of games. And so can we add the presence of violent imagery or take it away, but then we also pair it with competitive or non-competitive or frustrating or non-frustrating factors. And what they find is the violent content doesn't make a difference. It is just that competition and just that frustration factor. Now, the other weird thing with this research is we can't go out and watch, are you going to be violent as you go out to your car? If we put someone in front of you and say, okay, punch this person. How hard are you going to punch him? It's not ethical. We're working really hard to do good ethical research these days. So we have to test this in other ways. So the types of aggression for the research that is saying, look, we are being more aggressive, the things we're doing in this research is the researchers are saying, okay, you've played the game, you're feeling frustrated. Part 2 of the study, we're going to add hot sauce to a cup of water for another person. And then they're going to measure how much hot sauce do you choose to drip in or dump in for this other person. No one else has to drink it. We're just going to throw the cup out. So nobody is penalized and has to drink the hot sauce. But in that moment, we're like, oh, they just beat me. All the hot sauce. Other options in research have been loud blaring noises or some electric shock to the other person. I push a button, I choose how long to hold it down, I choose how high to put the voltage. Again, no one's on the receiving end of this actually, but in that moment. So we do see people act aggressively. What's the competitiveness? What's the frustration there? But arguably, this is at the level of pranks. And predominantly, this research has actually been done with college students. And so there's still a lot of wiggle room for, well, how much is this actually leading to aggression and violence if we're really thinking real-life violence type things? And so we really don't have that strong support at this time that that violent content is actually leading to more violent or aggressive behaviors. Now, the other side of this myth is this idea of desensitization. Desensitization is this idea that we're going to be less reactive to stimuli. So the more times we see something, the more times we're exposed, it's not going to bother us. So if we see imagery in a game that might be alarming or scary, very similar to if you watch a horror movie or a war-based movie, if we see this imagery, are we going to see it enough times that it doesn't bother us? For the game, yes, that's actually the case. We're not going to freak out in that space. But that doesn't fully change what we would do in a real life situation. Again, our video gamers are able to separate those spaces and see those as very different scenarios. So again, we have to come back, hello, come on in, to those ideas of how well do we understand that representation of reality versus the game scenarios and what's acceptable and appropriate there. And again, what's the age-appropriate level for games? My 8-year-old plays games, but we're going to be selective in what he sees at any one stage of his life. The other important thing is we're going to have conversations about what's okay in everyday experiences versus what might be okay in this game space. Now, on the positive side of this desensitization, it turns out some of this desensitization can be a good thing. Researchers are actually now starting, or therapists are now starting to use video games as a tool for desensitizing people from phobias. So in those spaces where something might be particularly scary and unnerving for you, we can slowly have you experience those things, but in a virtual way, where you can learn to be more comfortable, possibly get over a fear of flying, so you can go visit loved ones who are somewhere else. We also see that it turns out some of this desensitization is actually preparing people really well for high-stakes job situations. Games, and particularly virtual reality games, where you feel like the world has changed in front of you, leads to a much more immersive experience where people are able to retain the information better, and they're able to practice responding in real-life scenarios, or equivalent to real-life scenarios where it feels very real. And so if we need medical emergencies, surgical procedures, spaces where we don't really want to practice ethically, we can now have a space where we practice, and so folks are prepared to make better decisions, make faster decisions when the real situation comes up. And in fact, some of this space has also resulted in helping reduce the risk of PTSD for soldiers going to war, and also helping virtual reality games have also helped recover from PTSD flashbacks for soldiers who have come back and have suffered from PTSD as well. So we actually see a space where these games can actually be very helpful. All right, that's myth number one. Myth number two, games are bad for our vision. Staring at the screen, not a good thing, and there's no brain benefits. It turns out as we age, our eyes just get less good, naturally. What you see in the image here is the idea is if you were to stare directly ahead at a point, so you can pick, there's kind of a dot in the center of each one of these. As we age, what we can see without moving our eyes back and forth gets smaller and smaller. Now here we're thinking about it in a driving situation, and so as we age, the amount of content that you can see and process, deer running across the road, children running across the road, it gets more dangerous the more things go. And so it becomes a very important question. Are games making this process worse? Or could they possibly be making it better? It turns out they have actively designed games specifically to help improve your vision, particularly that peripheral vision, your side vision, to help maintain it or expand it a little bit more beyond its current status. So we have games specifically designed for this. The other interesting thing, for those who play particularly more action-based video games or games that have lots of dark, shadowy corners in them, in this scene, there's actually a few characters. Raise your hand if you can see anything out in the distance there. So here's actually my son's character playing Minecraft. And then there's a little red dot. There's a spider lurking in the corner. Folks who are playing games regularly get better at noticing this small gradation in color changes. Let's do one level harder. Depending on where you are in the room, this gets more challenging, but there's actually 3 objects for you to find in this space. There's one right in front. We've got the spider eyes over there. Oh, and I've lost one of them too now. I need to play more. Or do I? That's the question. So let's go back to our easy image. So research has found if we play at games that have these more dark corners, more active games where we might be concerned about what's in those corners, like those spiders, it turns out that we increase our ability to see this gray, shades of gray, which is known as contrast sensitivity, but we can actually improve that by about 15% by playing these games on a regular basis. Which means we're better at video games, good job. But it also means we're better at seeing in the fog. Which means we can be safer drivers, even if that peripheral vision is starting to shrink a little bit. And it turns out this also means that we're going to continue to see small fine print much later in life than we would have otherwise. So if you aren't playing games yet, it might be a good time to start. One of my favorite studies when we think about eyes and video games is they've actually done some research for lazy eye. For those of you who don't know, lazy eye is like when one eye kind of drifts off and so it looks to one side while your other eye is focused here. And so our eyes are muscles. The training to help support those with lazy eye in the past has been to actually have your good eye covered by an eye patch. And so the lazy one has to do the work to readjust. And so just like training at the gym, we're going to train that muscle back to the right position. It takes about 400 hours of constant eye patch, which if you were into pirates, awesome. But in a space where maybe it feels socially awkward at school or at work to have your good eye covered, it's not so great. But they've actually designed video games. So here we have Pac-Man. So we've got our little creature who eats Pac-Man, who eats ghosts, running around the screen. And typically when we play video games, those two images are together. But they designed a special binocular interactive treatment where they separate the two. One eye gets to see the map. The other eye gets to see the characters where they would be on the map. And we're typically 400 hours of an eye patch. We can get the same level of benefit for the same length of time in 2 hours of gameplay. I know, it's like magic. So 2 hours of playing a video game, we now have several months of corrected vision, or more corrected than before, and the same equivalent of effort and support that we would see in non-video game space. So we can do things a little bit faster sometimes in games. It's not the only way to do it, but it is an option. And it may be more exciting, more engaging for some participants. So we can think about our eye as a muscle. It turns out our brain is also a muscle as well. The more you're working with it, engaging it, playing games with other people, the stronger it gets, the stronger it stays as we age. Particularly our action-based video games where you might have to fight monsters, you have to manage your health, you have to manage your inventory, you have to keep track of their health to know what kind of magic spells to throw at them. Very complicated. But it turns out all of those things and keeping track of the map tends to lead to better hand-eye coordination, better skills at divided attention, focusing on those multiple stimuli on the screen all at once, and better ability to do mental rotation and visualization. So we can test out your abilities here. So here we've got our indicator block. I want you to look at this three-dimensional object and figure out which of these four options, here's your multiple choice test, I'm a professor, we got to do it, which of these shapes is actually the same one, but just rotated in a different direction. I hear some whispers. How many say A? B? Oh, we got some B's. C? Oh, okay. D? All right, so we've got three potential contenders here. Trick question, it was actually two of them. Couple of you caught it. So if you said B or C, or even preferably both, you were correct. Raise your hand if this was super easy. Some of you are in, you're like, this is my jam. Again, that competitiveness comes out. I heard those answers come out real quick. Yes, I said it first. Let's try one more. If we were to fold up, imagine this is a paper box. If we were to fold up the paper box, which one is it? Only one correct answer this time. Ooh, I see a hand in the back. You're going with C? I've got some people nodding with you. Let's find out. Well done. All right. We've got our young kids really focused in on this. Excellent. So this is a cool thing. Again, we're feeling good. We solved the puzzle. Interestingly, there's a lot of research out there that says that women are not as good at spatial orientation activities as men. It's not great. And a number of studies support this. Some of the arguments behind this suggest, though, that it's based on what experiences you've had. If you were given a lot of toys, such as Barbie, not a lot of spatial orientation. The clothes are hard to put on, but in different ways. Versus if you're given Lego to play with, now we're thinking about that three-dimensional shape. And so if you started with more training, and I'm not knocking Barbie, the movie was great. But if we don't also get this practice with Lego or Minecraft, which does the same thing, we're not going to develop those skills. Cool space for video games, playing these action video games, and maneuvering around the maps, women catch up very quickly. Whatever gender gap was happening doesn't have to continue to exist. So even if you had a slower start, you can get right back up there. So we see that it improves these abilities as well. Now, the other side of this we can think about is what's our level of attention? So we can focus on the brain itself, not just those visuals. And what we see, they've done studies looking at individuals 60 and older, and they asked them to play this game called Neuro Racer. So it's a driving video game. Your job is to stay in the track as best you can. We're going to wander to the edges a little bit, but stay in the middle as best you can. But then you also need to do a distraction test. When you see certain colorful images and shapes pop up, you have to push a button as fast as you can. We're going to throw some that look close but not quite right. Don't push the button. It turns out 12 hours of this game, not continuously, in like half-hour to 1-hour chunks over the course of a month, they saw 6 months improvement in working memory and attention. 12 hours of play over the course of a month, and you get 6 months benefit. And we're capping it at 6 months because that's when their research money ran out. So it's possible those benefits extended, but for at least 6 months, we're seeing improvement in that working memory, that attention. You also get good at the game so you can impress those grandkids. I can play the driving games just as well as you. Very cool. And it turns out this attention aspect, so what are you focusing on, is really, really important. Newer research is looking at, can we use attention to actually help heal people's bodies? They have a game called Snow World, specifically designed for pain management, particularly in burn treatment units. When individuals are going in for burn treatments, the treatment is actually a very painful process. But they started including a VR-based game where folks focus on playing this game that feels cold, and it reduces significantly the amount of pain that they feel during that treatment process. The brain is distracted, the brain's going elsewhere. Remember that flow state we talked about before? You're having fun here. You don't feel the pain nearly as much. They're also finding that playing games like Mario Brothers, Tetris, things like this, can be enough of a distraction while you're waiting to go into a surgical procedure, especially for young children, that we significantly reduce that anxiety. And that also means that their body is in a more comfortable, relaxed space to process and handle whatever surgical procedure, and they wake up from the anesthetics much more comfortably and much more relaxed, which is all very beneficial for that healing process long term for the actual thing going on. And so it turns out distraction can actually be a really good thing. This even has found out, so here's Tetris we talked about before. We're dropping our shapes. Tetris has been found to be an excellent thing to distract you if you're starting to have cravings. If you're trying to eat a few less donuts or trying to quit smoking, 10 minutes of gameplay might work you through that craving that you're having in the moment to help you stick with whatever good health goal that you're currently working on for yourself. All right, so that's myth number 2. Last myth we need to deal with is this idea of social isolation. We tend to get this image in our head of some teenager in their smelly cave-like room. That's going to happen anyways. But they're playing video games, they're not talking to anyone, they're grunting at you if you do try to talk to them. I'm going to make a space. It's up to you if that's how things are going to work out. There is a space where some people do become very socially isolated, and focused on their game. It's not a perfect system, but it's also a choice. Because it turns out games can also be a really great way to connect. So here we have my son Ian. He's playing video games in his slightly cave-like room. It's Star Wars themed right now. But his cat Oliver is cuddling with him and will occasionally come up for pets. And what you can't see well on the side is that his phone is actually over here, so we've now got 2 devices because his best friend is in California this summer. And so now they're video chatting and they're playing Minecraft together. And so we're still maintaining those social play dates, even though they're very far apart this summer. And so can it be a way to connect with people who are far away, other awesome adults in our lives? It can create space to play with and connect without needing to physically get up and move around if that's not your thing. Remember that hide and seek game we were going to try to play before? We can all sit comfortably, especially when it's hot out. It also creates a good space to have real conversations. When your kid is distracted playing the game, they're not putting on as many of those social airs of, I'm not going to talk to you, you're the adult. They're more open having a conversation. And there's a space to talk about, what does this content mean? What does this look like in reality as well? The pandemic was really important for video games and maintaining those social connections. A whole bunch of games focused on connecting people. So we've got our Words with Friends. A lot of folks were playing Stardew Valley or Among Us and having these sneaky games of attack where you could interact online and still feel like you're around other people. They're making whole towns that they can interact and send presents to each other. And we have games like Pokemon Go that focus on let's get back outside. For Pokemon Go is a game that you play on your phone, and they have you go to specific locations. It's very similar to geocaching, where you're going to go into environments and you're going to find these virtual things and collect them. But then you can also play and trade with other people, and it actually encourages you to go to places like the library or other community centers, art facilities in your town. So it gets you exposed to the world around you as well. Now, the other side of this, I would also like to argue that social isolation is okay once in a while, too. Taking a break from reality, shutting down in your own corner, there's nothing wrong with that. But balanced in moderation, just like all things in life. The other interesting space that is really a high focus of research right now is looking at social isolation in senior living centers, where that happens a lot already. And it turns out games is a really great way to disrupt that social isolation. In fact, there's a lot of effort right now looking at putting VR options into senior living homes. So here we've got folks. So they look silly on the outside. We now have robots for eyes. But what they're seeing is they're seeing a whole world, and if they look up, they look down, it's a whole different environment that's three-dimensional in front of them. Some of these are very silly and cartoony worlds. Some of these look like the real thing. And in fact, one of the things they're trying to do right now is they're trying to create these real-world-like experiences, such as traveling to countries that you maybe had wanted to do but didn't quite get on your bucket list, or places you'd like to go back to, or traveling on a plane, swimming with sharks and dolphins. You can do that in these spaces. And so what they've been doing is they've created group VR sessions where everyone goes and watches the same world. So you can all swim through the ocean together, and then you go back at lunch. And guess what? You have a new experience to talk about. Yeah. And what they found is 2 weeks of a daily practice of these communal VR sessions has led to improved mood and well-being and reduced the risk of depression and social isolation in these senior living centers. Again, magic. All right, so these are the 3 myths that I wanted to talk about today. As we get to questions, I'm happy to address some of the myths that you know about. The last piece that I promised that we talk about is this idea of, can video games save the world? I shared that I study motivation and academic motivation, and one of those big elements is what's known as growth mindset. How many of you have heard of growth mindset? We got a couple folks. Okay. So growth mindset. So the 2 options you have is a growth mindset where you are willing to try new things, not going to give up very easily, versus a fixed mindset, which often tends to be either I'm good at something or it's not my thing. And some of us have this naturally in one direction or the other. It turns out most of us have both. For some things, I'm going to have a growth mindset. I'm willing to try new things. I'll get better with practice. And there's a couple lingering things. Nope, that's not my thing. I'm not doing that. For some of you, video games might have been that fixed mindset. Nope, not going to try that. That seems hard. But it turns out when we have a fixed mindset, so on the red side, we tend to see failure as fear-inducing. We think about failing at something that's scary. I'd rather not. Let's just not even risk it as an option. Versus in a growth mindset, failure is a challenge. Can I do better next time? Think for yourself. When we did the mental rotation spatial puzzles, once you understood it from the first one, did you try harder with the second one? Or did you shut down like, nope, this isn't my game? That's going to be that difference. How did you approach that problem? How did you approach that challenge? For active continuing and growing, that growth mindset's the best one. It's good to develop as a kid. It's important to maintain as an adult or develop as an adult. Please don't have a fixed mindset about getting a growth mindset. We're going to move. We're going to change that language. I can do this. I can try. And it's okay if I make mistakes. And it's okay if I fail 20 times or 120 times. We're going to keep trying. Video games are so awesome at actually developing this growth mindset. Because many video games start with something really easy. Can you make your character run across the screen? Then we'll add some jumping, maybe jumping over some stuff. Then we're going to add some rewards. That mushroom we actually probably don't want to touch. Who knows what's going to happen there. There's some scary flowers in here. Don't go down that too. But you're going to learn that. They don't know that yet. So we're going to have this space where we're going to learn, and we're going to get better, and eventually, oh boy, we now have flames of fire spinning around. Most people don't play this level, don't worry. But when we think about games, what we see is we actually scaffold and build challenges, and so you feel, remember our flow, a little bit of ability, a little bit of challenge, and they grow together. And so you keep getting better, you keep getting more excited. We're going to get that positive feedback. We can see we beat the first two levels. A lot of things in real life scenarios, we don't necessarily see that part where like, I made progress. It was better than last time. We just feel that, oh, again, I missed it again. But games are really good at showing you and giving you that feedback. You did well. Just not quite enough yet. And so we keep trying. So you get that progress, you get that feedback, and eventually you get that reward. Sorry. Now, in addition to getting to the castle and getting to pull down that flag and possibly seeing a princess, the other reward is that all this growth mindset we've been building leads to reductions in anxiety about failure, which means if we can develop it here, we might be more motivated to try in other things, like school or jobs or trying to get that new job or promotion. And we're more willing to try again when things didn't go right or the way we expected the first time, and we're more willing to persist long term in the game and also outside of the game. Which leads us back to the third thing about me that you need to know. I'm an educator who's trying to save the world. I'm trying to find ways, I'm trying to find tools to give to other people that you can help save the world by saving yourself, making the world a little bit cooler, a little bit better for somebody else. We're not going to save the whole world in one big moment, but it's going to be lots of little moments and lots of little growth mindset moments for yourself. And so the last couple slides I want to show you is about thinking about how can video games be an application or that tool to help you do things just a little bit better for yourself or for someone else. In the world of physical therapy, games are becoming really, really popular. Remember, we're persisting longer at the task. We care more about it. It turns out making physical therapy exercises into a game leads to people persisting longer, willing to do more of them. I have done physical therapy many, many times in my life. Some of my physical therapists have motivated me in a way that I go home and I do all my exercises and I get better in time, on track. Some of them have not been so motivating, And I go home, and I did not do the exercises I was supposed to. But it turns out, if there's a game, well, now we're invested in the story. Now we're invested in the progress of our character. It feels more fun. I see myself improving because the game's showing me I'm improving. And we tend to actually follow through with those training programs better. So here we've got physical therapy with a young individual. Over here, this gentleman is actually doing physical therapy after having a stroke. Video games are actually becoming a really good tool for developing the hand-eye coordination, thinking about some of those brain skills and those physical skills at the same time if you're recovering from a stroke. And then our third image here in the middle, they're actually starting to use those virtual reality goggles as a mixed method training for fall prevention. So before the injury, so you don't need to do the physical therapy, can we have you practice your balance skills, practice getting over objects so you don't fall and hurt something in the first place, which is a really cool preventative medicine situation. Now, those games are all intended for specific treatments and environments, but it turns out there's lots of games that are easily accessible to the general audience that can also help your physical well-being as well. Games like Wii Fit, Beat Saber is at the top here. Beat Saber is one of my personal favorites at the moment. So you have those red and blue blocks flying at you, again in this three-dimensional space, and you get to hold lightsabers. And music is playing. You get to choose the music, and then you're chopping things to the beat of the music and destroying these blocks. When the goggles come off, you're all sweaty, your heart's racing, you're like, whoa, what happened? It's fantastic. You get the exercise in, you've had fun, you're maintaining your physical health, so we're not falling in things in other spaces. It turns out exercise, whether it's in a video game or just with your friends or at home or in a group fitness class, also helps reduce your risks of depression. Exercise has been found to be the equivalent of a low-dose depression medication in helping maintain mental health. I'm not saying we get entirely rid of the medication, but it can be an alternative option or an additional option as well for some folks. In the space of our physical health, but in a slightly different way, there's actually a lot of games and a lot of online tools and apps that are really focused on habit building. Those of you who have a Fitbit, the term gamification came up at the beginning of the presentation. We're going to track your steps. Can you move for 10 more steps this hour? Some of you might have even felt your buzzer go off. You're like, I got to shake my arm. Got to get, I got to get my hour in. And that's added a game element to that experience to help you to think about your health. Plant Nanny is a really cute game where you get to grow flowers, and it's based on encouraging you to drink more water. You drink a cup of water, the plant gets a cup of water. Your plant grows, it flourishes. If you don't drink the water, it's going to be real sad. And some of us struggle with taking care of ourselves, but we don't struggle when it comes to taking care of others. So if we have that other being that we need to focus on, we will do a better job at taking care of ourselves. And so it's that small trick, but it brings ultimately that good health benefit to yourself. There's quite a few on here. I'm happy to chat about any of these with you after the presentation as well. In the world of medicine, we're also looking at games right now. This is a game called Fold It that's available and free to play. This one is less of a game where you're earning points so much, but instead you're moving an object around and trying to connect these different components, specifically for a molecule. And what they found is when we're trying to do things like cure cancer or understand the proteins in the formation of cancer, computers are not good at modeling what those shapes are. Computers are getting better at shapes and pictures, but they're not great yet. But humans are. And so a couple of game designers paired with some scientists, and they created this game called Fold It, where we now have people internationally playing this game and making new shapes. And actually in the course of 3 weeks, they were able to identify a protein associated with cancer. So we didn't fully cure cancer, but we are understanding cancer. And they are I forgot to mark the date. I want to say 2014. But this game has been going on, and they've been throwing in different types of proteins to understand lots of different types Again, free game for you to play. You could help cure science or cure cancer. They also have games like Sea Hero that are trying to understand. One of the spaces they're interested in right now is dementia and Alzheimer's and memory loss. And so they have this game called Sea Hero Quest where they weren't curing dementia or Alzheimer's, but they were understanding what are some of those predictors and those early onset symptoms to understand it to help provide more support for individuals early on, moving in that direction of cures, but starting in these early phases. Other areas they're working on that right now is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, multiple sclerosis, and depression are all spaces that they're looking at. Can games help? Can games fix in some way, prevent in some way? Now, those are big science, big ask things. To end the presentation today, I'd like it to bring it to some simple games that you have readily available if you have a smartphone right now. Games like Candy Crush or Angry Birds or Tetris. Easily downloadable onto your phone, easy to play for 5 to 10 minutes. It turns out these can actually help your mental health as well. Do be careful if you've not played these games before. There will be a ton of ads and a ton of opportunities for you to click on something you don't want. But the game itself, research has found that 20 minutes 3 times a week leads to improved moods, energy levels. It actually improves your heart rate variability, so it keeps your heart more consistent, and it helps you make more resistant to stress. It also is decreasing your level of depression, anxiety, tension, and that anger that we started with. Ooh, not so aggressive after all. Now, in this study, what they found was this was the equivalent to mindfulness meditation. So if games aren't your thing, meditation is also a very good option to help improve and reduce these things. Interestingly, they also compared it to 20 minutes 3 times a week of internet surfing. That didn't help. There's a space and a reason to do the internet surfing, but it's not going to be the same as this active, engaged gameplay that you can do on a regular basis. So this one is Angry Birds. The premise is you're going to have these little birds that you're going to slingshot and destroy things. Candy Crush. It turns out all of those games are going to give you some of those benefits. So it doesn't have to specifically be these ones. So if we bring this full circle, we see that there's really not a lot of support for these myths, or they're at a much smaller scale than what a lot of people claim in the mass media. And I would like to argue that through the use of motivation and distractions and attention, that we actually can use games to help improve our lives, improve our connection with other people, and in a small way, save the world. Thank you very much for your time.
Please raise your hand if you have a question. I'll start off with one. Have any of your studies dealt with addiction behavior where somebody plays a game forever and ever, and it's just really easy to push that button and kind of like the arm on the slot machine?
Yes, and that's exactly the space that they look at is gambling addiction. So I haven't researched it myself, but the research that I have read about it, what we see is the term addiction is a complicated one when we think about a behavioral thing. One of the spaces where we see people becoming more engrossed in games is particularly in online games where you may have a community of people, particularly internationally, and so the time zone. Because if we think about, like I heard some of you speaking about a book club, we're all going to meet at 6 p.m. Well, 6 p.m. is different for everybody on the team. The time that you can check in to go play can be challenging. And also the spaces when it comes to things like our growth mindset. In the game, you're doing well. You're succeeding in life. We're not all succeeding at life in the real world all the time. And so there is that risk of space if you feel like everything else is awful, but people like me, and I'm succeeding here. There is a space that some people can get drawn in. But it's actually a very small percentage of people that gets sucked in at that level.
If you touched on some, like Alzheimer's and some of those things, if I were to consider the virtual reality goggles as sort of a non-competitive stimulus game, let's say. Is there any studies that that have been ongoing or are being contemplated, do you think, for what it could do to slow down the dementia development in the brain?
That's something they're actively studying right now. From the research that I've had access to, they don't have answers for that yet, but that's something that's actively of high priority right now. There's a group called Neuroscape, and I can share the website with you afterwards, that is one of the leading groups kind of focusing on some of that research right now.
Now, you're talking about gaming as a means to combat depression. What if, like with mine, I do a lot of journaling and a lot of socializing.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Does that actually take away from that? Or should I start doing that instead of what I'm doing?
I would definitely not take away from the things that are working for you already. We're all going to have different things that help. So what's working, doing that. It could be an additional add-on thing that's worth trying. But definitely I would never take away anything that already is giving you success.
What about all the wonderful AARP games?
Oh, I had one. I edited my slides and there was a game. There's some games that are actually good for your mental health and your peripheral vision with AARP that are good options for those things. So I would definitely take advantage of those. Thank you for calling that out.
I have a question. I have 9 grandkids, and at various times they've tried to get us into playing the video games with them, sit down and play them. And honestly, I cannot get anything to move the right way at all. It reminds me of the picture you showed about the controller being the wrong way. That's how I felt it was. And is that just because I'm not spending enough time on doing it? I just sit down and they try to explain it, and I've given up.
Some games have kinder controls than others, so maybe encourage them to just throw some other games at you. I know for myself, there are certain controller setups that don't make sense to me, and the game is awful. My family's playing, and I'm failing. But you can actually change the controls in some games, and so if you want this button to do that thing, you can switch the settings to make it easier for you to play. And so I would challenge your grandkids to figure out how to do that to get you in. I'll make a deal, you do this, and then we play.
Quiet group tonight.
It's just 3 of us chatting. Where do we find the ARP games?
How do we get to them? AARP.org.
Yeah, no, thank you for the assist. Very cool.
What about card games like bridge and solitaire?
So those are going to be great for that mental stimulation. You're involved, you're socializing with other people as you play
Sudoku.
the games. Yep, all of those are going to help in some categories. For the vision piece, that won't help in that category. But again, just kind of like the depression question. Do the things that are working well for you. Definitely don't give up those games. They're helping in some spaces, but it may not be that full range of all the things that we talked about.
We have a friend who is one of the writers for Call of Duty, whatever it is.
Very cool.
You had it up there for the gray.
Yes, so the contrast sensitivity function, so that's that grayscale. And so games like Call of Duty where you're going around corners and there's a lot of dark shadows. Really any games that do that, but Call of Duty was the one that they actually used in that particular study.
I'm going to be at his daughter's birthday party this weekend, so I want to tell him that.
Excellent, very cool.
You had mentioned in your presentation games that were specifically targeted at issues that older people might have, like dementia, or how would that just be through a therapist's office, or are there ways to access games that are specifically targeted?
So the research with the dementia games might be new enough. I don't know how much of that is actually accessible yet or more in the research phase, but I would definitely talk to your doctor about options like that. Lumosity is a good one for just kind of brain training in general, and they have one just called Brain Trainer. But those would be some good options broadly for the cognitive benefits, which may help support the dementia piece, but that's honestly way beyond my expertise to speak too much to, so I apologize.
Is it better to play one game consistently or to mix them up?
Mix them up. If you can find more things to have fun with, I mean, if there's only one, do your one. But each of them is going to challenge your brain in a different way and is going to use different skills. And so then you get that full rainbow spectrum of all these possible skills.
I have a question. So do the game designers intentionally target these benefits, try and plant things in there that are going to give you this benefit, or did they just design the games for fun and the researchers found out later that they provide benefits?
Some of both. There are some researchers who are actively trying to, like, let's make things to do a good thing. So like the Pac-Man for Lazy Eye, they took a game that already existed and added an element for it. Games like Fold It were specifically to do a science-based thing, and then some of them were just fun games that they said, hey, let's see if this works. So like Call of Duty just happens to work. One I didn't talk about is a game called Rayman Raving Rabbids, which is just this really silly, off-the-wall, crazy game for children. But they've actually found that playing that game has helped improve some forms of dyslexia. Again, bringing in this aspect of attention, the kids are focusing, there's a fair amount of text that you need to read, and so creating a fun space where you're not thinking about, I'm not doing well at reading right now, was actually helping reduce some forms of the dyslexia, but with a game just meant for fun. Rayman Raving Rabbids, and there's bunnies in the game, but it's Rabbids. Very silly. I can write it down for you too if you want.
Yeah, the one thing that I didn't know, so when I was working with computers and doing games or whatever, is that if you're looking at the screen for an extended period of time, you will wind up with a vision problem that's called a computer refresh. And in order to avoid that, you need to force yourself to blink occasionally.
Yes, blinking is important, especially if you get into the VR stuff. As soon as it's the whole world, it's easy to forget to blink. But blinking and definitely taking breaks. Playing for 5 hours in a row, not recommended. Hour to half hours, good for vision, but you can, just like exercise. Exercise is good. Too much in one session, not good.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
You were talking about games that use controllers, but there's so many games on the iPad or on your computer that you're pretty much just using your thumbs or a pencil or something like that to play it. Is there any difference? Like, is there any benefit to game controllers get better triggered to the brain or something?
Not
like
that I've seen.
Okay.
Yeah, it's more about what's your brain doing in the moment. Interestingly, researchers early on, when people started like taking notes on the computer for classes, they're like, oh no, handwritten notes are better. The science has updated, and it turns out handwritten notes tend to be better, but not because you wrote them with your hand. For people who are trained in typing, you can type all the things, because you can type much faster than you can write. And so people were just regurgitating and not thinking. Whereas if you have to pick and choose what was the important details, you actively thought about and you made choices, and that's what helps the learning process. And so same thing, your brain's doing the important thing. The hands are just extra.
Okay. I don't know if it was given better coordination or something like that. No difference.
Not in the research that I've seen, but it's a really good question.
I just had a question. Two things you mentioned. One was taking breaks, one was flow. And many of us put our hands up, we're doing Wordle. I have 3 cousins. We all live separate. We do Wordle. Well, I can't stop after Wordle. Then I have to do Dordle. Then I have to do Chortle, Quartle, and Octortle. I'm thinking it's almost like a dopamine hit. I pick up my phone and I'm going to check messages and I'm doing Wordle.
100%.
How can we, is that a good or a bad thing? Is it important to maybe put a time limit on this kind of stuff?
Dopamine is awesome. Dopamine is actually going to be one of those things that reduces the risk of depression or minimizes some of those symptoms. So go for the dopamine hit. The space to always think about, and this kind of gets back to the addiction question, are you wordling, quirtling, quarterling, turtling? I didn't know them all. Are you doing that so much that you have forgotten to eat, go to work, go to your social obligation? If you, if it's not interfering with your daily life, you're good. If your eyes aren't exhausted and you're still blinking, right? Okay, then I would say it's good. It's that space where you're like, well, now I'm not going to go out to dinner with my friends because I'd rather stay here. And that's where we get that social isolation piece. These are great questions.
I play a lot, it's just more of an anecdote than a question, but I play a lot of Words with Friends, and there's some people that I met randomly and I've played with for years, and I kind of feel like we have a relationship, like I know their personality, but you don't. I mean, there's very little chat. Occasionally you might say,
But you care about
Happy
that?
New Year or something. But
Do you care about that person?
There are people that I prefer to play with than others, and I don't know if it's because I win more against them, or they're more, challenging. That I think that they're more intelligent than I am, and I want to be like them. Or I don't know. It's just interesting to me that I've ascribed personalities to these little pictures of people.
No, and that's great. And that's actually, we've created now this empathy. You potentially care about these other people, or they make you mad or annoy you. And so we've made new social connections with people. In some games, people have actually become friends and do get to talk to each other and have decided to meet in person and become best friends. In some games, people have met and got married after the fact. My husband and I both did grad school at the same time, and we actually lived apart in separate states for several years. We would play World of Warcraft, and that was our hangout time that got us through living separately while trying to get through school. And so there's a lot of spaces for that.
I think we need to wrap things up. I'm sure Chelsea would answer any individual questions if you need to not embarrass yourself with a public question or whatever. Thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you all for your time tonight.